Hey everybody, it's me, Steve Schnee, the CD Junkie. On this episode of CD Junkie, I'm going to be talking about a band called Status Quo, or Status Quo as I call them because, I'm American. But this is just a superb band, one of my favorite bands of all time. I got into them a little bit late, actually. They've been around since the mid to late 60s, but I didn't get into them until one day when I saw the beginning of Live Aid in 1985, I think it was, and that blew my mind. And they opened the show, and ever since then, I've been a Quo fan, and I followed them. In fact, when I saw them live in 2003 at the House of Blues in Anaheim, my favorite show of all time. I've seen The Jam, XTC, Squeeze, Split Enz, all those great, wonderful bands that I've loved. But the Status Quo show that I saw then was the greatest live show I've ever seen. It was such a pleasure to be there. But there's so many titles, I'm not going to really be able to go too much in depth. If you want to know more about the band, I suggest you maybe check out their website or go to Wikipedia or talk to another fan, find out more things in depth, because I want to make this a short CD Junkie video, but fit in every studio album. I'm not going to fit in any live. Yes, it was the greatest live show I've seen, but I don't own any live Quo CDs, only because I'm not a big fan of live CDs. Live shows, yes, of course. And I maybe have just a couple compilations to show you, but I'm going to focus on the studio albums. We're going to focus on the first album right now. This one is Picturesque Matchstickable Messages from the Status Quo. This is actually when they were called The Status Quo. This came out in 1968, and the band at this time, by the way, this is the expanded edition with the mono and stereo editions. The band, Francis Rossi on guitar and vocals, Rick Parfitt on guitar and vocals, Alan Lancaster on bass, and John Coughlin on drums, and a gentleman by the name of Roy Lyons on organ, piano, and electric piano. Very psychedelic. This, of course, is the album that Pictures of Matchstick Men came from. And if you like that song, this whole album is full of that sort of psych pop. And like I said, it's got a bunch of bonus tracks on there as well. Definitely one to check out. Now, by the time they came out with their second album, Spare Parts, they had changed their name to Status Quo. And this album came out in 1969 along the same lines as the first album, but maybe a little mellower, maybe a little bit more melodic too, more poppy. And this, of course, is the expanded edition there. And then finally, they were tired of that sound. They discovered songs like Roadhouse Blues by The Doors, and they put out a single called Down the Dustpipe, which is an amazing song, absolutely amazing. Wasn't on any album, but that was the first really sign of this great blues direction they were going in. And the same band made this album, which is Ma Kelly's Greasy Spoon, came out in 1970, and this is them starting that whole boogie heads down rock and roll, wearing the denim, growing their hair long. This is the kind of album where you can just smell the booze and weed and just rock out with the band. But that's their third album, Ma Kelly's Greasy Spoon, came out in 1970. By the time of Dog of Two Head in 1971, Roy Lyons had left the band. So, they were working with some people, like Bob Young would come in and play harmonica on some tracks. Bernie Frost would write songs with Francis, so they became integral in the whole tapestry of Status Quo, but they sort of remained in the background, and the fans, of course, knew who they were. Now, those first four albums are considered like, let's say stage one of Status Quo. And so, there's a lot of compilations that will bring those tracks together. This brings hits together, album tracks, and even songs by some of the pre-Status Quo bands like the Spectres and stuff. And it's a great compilation. It covers the psychedelic years into the beginning of the heads down boogie rock and roll. Now, that whole scene really took off in 1972 with Piledriver. This is the 2 CD version with the second disc and loads of bonus tracks. This is just great, sweaty, head down boogie rock and roll with great melodies. That's the thing. Status Quo, they played great rock and roll, but they had great hooks. They were songwriters and they were rockers. It was really fantastic. This is the album with like Paper Plane and all these great songs that are still in the band's set today. Now, the next album was called Hello, and that came out in 1973. And of course, the big song off of this, of course, is Caroline, which I think opens every show for the last 50 years or so. And this is the expanded edition with some bonus stuff on there as well. Then came the album Quo in 1974. More great rock and roll, boogie, head down rock and roll. Fantastic, absolutely wonderful. On the Level, one of my favorites, and that's got a lot of great songs on it. This is, of course, the expanded edition. If anybody wants to see what songs are on it, you can freeze the screen, and then you can look at the bonus tracks, or you can just look them up online. Now, in 1976 comes the album Blue for You. Now, a couple tracks on this album feature keyboardist Andy Bown, who would actually be with Status Quo up to now, but he wasn't an official member at this point. And this is another great rock and roll album. Now, I have to admit that I love Quo from beginning to end, but there are certain people only love the psychedelic stuff. There are some people that only love the real boogie rock and roll. And usually the stuff that I showed you from Piledriver up to Blue for You, those are really the hardcore boogie rock and roll albums. Now, this is kind of a real turning point album for them. It's called Rockin' All Over the World. Came out in 1977, produced by Pip Williams, and he sort of smoothed out that rock edge and brought the pop up, because it used to be that Status Quo was let's say 75% rock and roll, 25% melody. This brought it up to about 50-50. And some people draw the line here and they say, no, I want them to be a rock and roll band, so I only like the albums up to Blue for You. I mean, that's perfectly fine. I love it all. And this actually features the original album plus a remix of the album, a modern day remix of the album. And it's absolutely really fantastic. A lot of great songs, a lot of great melodies. And of course, the title track is the John Fogerty track, and that has become a signature song for them. If you can't stand the heat, from 1978, more great pop and boogie. Like I said, Andy Bown is on these albums. He's just not an official member yet, because I believe he was signed to another label as a solo artist, so he couldn't legally become a member of the band. And here is Whatever You Want. Came out in 1979. That's a great cover. And again, deluxe edition. Loads of bonus tracks. Now, all those albums had been produced by Pip Williams. And then when Just Supposing came out, this was produced by John Eden. And this is another great album. Never Too Late came out in 1981, and this was the last album with the original lineup. John Coughlin had left the band after this album, and he was replaced by a gentleman by the name of Pete Kircher. So on the album 1 + 9 + 8 + 2, 1982 = 20, this is actually the first album that Andy Bown is listed as a full-time member. And this is another fine album, really poppy, going in that poppy direction that I love so much. 1983, out comes Back to Back. Another fine album. This is kind of the album that drew the line. Alan Lancaster wanted to be a rock and roller, while Francis and maybe Rick wanted to be more pop, wanted to be more commercial. And when they put out the single Margarita Time, Alan Lancaster refused to appear in the video. So, of course, after this album, Alan Lancaster left. And it was kind of a, you know what, let's just call it a day. So the band sort of went on their final tour. And about a year after their final tour, they were called back to open up Live Aid. So they sort of reunited, and that Live Aid show reignited their fire, and they said, yeah, we want to get together, we want to go out and rock and roll, but Alan, not you. So what they did is, Rick had been working on a solo album in 1985, and he was working with a bass player, John Edwards, who I'd seen live when he played with Dexy's Midnight Runners, and a drummer by the name of Jeff Rich. So they brought them on. So it was Francis, Rick, Andrew Bown, and John Rhino Edwards, and Jeff Rich. And this is a pop-orific album. This shows the return of Pip Williams on production. Dave Edmunds actually produced a few tracks off the album as well. And of course, the hardcore boogie fans are not a big fan of that album. Me, myself, and I, we love that album. Anyway, 1988, out comes the Incomplainin', which is more commercial pop, more synth keyboards, great hooky melodies, but it still had that rock and roll feel to it. But again, it was more melody, 60%, boogie rock and roll 40%, maybe even 30%, but it was still just a great collection of songs. This is an actual 3 CD deluxe edition. Fantastic, great value for your money. Loads of non-album tracks, live recordings, etc. Now, in 1989 in the US, this album came out, just self-titled, and most of this album is made up of the Incomplainin' album, but they took a couple tracks off of the In the Army Now album and this is one of their few American releases, and that is that album there. 1989, in the UK, out comes Perfect Remedy, which I think is a great record. It has one of my favorite Quo songs called Going Down for the First Time, and it's got some other great songs on it. It's not a totally solid 100% great album. In fact, I think the band sort of wrote this album off, but I think it's a great addition if you love the poppier side of Status Quo like I do. 1991, out comes the album Rock Till You Drop, which is sort of bringing the rock and roll back up there, and this is another great, fantastic deluxe edition full of great songs. Thirsty Work came out in 1994. I love this album. I think it's pretty much sort of like Ain't Complainin', where it's just really pop-oriented, really hook-oriented, and not really focusing on that rock and roll, even though it's definitely Status Quo. There's no denying that sound. In 1996, Pip Williams was brought back in and produced this collection of cover versions called Don't Stop. But this is unique. Of course, Don't Stop is the Fleetwood Mac song, but they also do like Safety Dance by Men Without Hats, and Fun 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 actually features backing vocals by the Beach Boys. Lots of great songs on there. This is a deluxe edition with bonus tracks. 1999 comes Under the Influence. I love this record. Little White Lies, one of my favorite Quo songs. Great collection of songs. Again, you know, they're just showing that they're great songwriters, and that's really what's important to me. Well, it's important to a lot of people, but I go to Quo for the songwriting and then the boogie rock and roll, and this is just great songwriting from top to bottom. I love that album. Then, of course, because that Don't Stop album, you know, the covers album here, that was so popular. That was one of their best-selling albums. The label said, come on in and do it again. So Famous in the Last Century is another covers album. This came out in 2000, and this is the version with a few bonus tracks on it. Now, at this point, Jeff Rich decided to leave the band, which is the first lineup change in a few years. So they brought in Matt Letley, and they put out Heavy Traffic in 2002. Excellent album. This is the perfect thing if you're looking for great songs and great rock and roll. Heavy Traffic, and this album just shot them back up the charts again. This was a big album that rejuvenated their career, and this is, of course, just the regular version. I think actually there might be a bonus track on here, but it's a fantastic album. It came out in the US. This is the tour I saw them on, and they blew my mind. Wonderful, fantastic. Love the Quo. Remember how I told you that those two covers albums did really well? Well, guess what? The label wanted to do another one. This one came out in 2003, and it's called Riffs, and they did more odd, unique covers like Pump It Up by Elvis Costello, and they did some of their own tracks, and it came with a DVD there. Then they promised at that point that that was going to be their last full covers album. And they were still going to do covers on their albums, but full covers album. And so far, they've stuck to that. Anyway, out comes The Party Ain't Over in 2005. Another great collection. Maybe not as strong as the last few studio albums, but still some fine songs. And here's the deluxe edition. 2007, Pip Williams back in production and In Search of the Fourth Chord. Another fine album by the Quo. This one I think is probably equal to the Party Ain't Over Yet. Got some great songs on it, maybe not as focused, but I love the album title. It does have some fantastic songs. Now, the real surprise was 2011, Quid Pro Quo. This album is just so energetic. I mean, I don't want to say it's punk, but it is just heavy-handed rock and roll. It's not metal. It's not overblown. It's not overproduced. It's not them trying to sound like anybody else. It just sounds like they have this energy and this fire again. And from what I understand, I think Francis might blow it off as just another album. But it's if this is one that you stumble across, definitely any of these albums are going to introduce you to the Quo sound. Now, this is an unpopular opinion. Now, first off, Quo actually, you know, like the Beatles did and like Herman's Hermits did, Quo actually made a movie, right? But too bad they waited until 2013 to make it. Co-starring John Lovitz, Bula Quo was bullshit, if you ask me, the movie. But I love the soundtrack because it's so poppy and so fun. I love this, and this, of course, is a 2 CD version. This is one of my favorite Quo albums to listen to just because it's so poppy, so fun. The movie, not so much. At that point, Matt Letley left the band, and they brought in Leon Cave on drums, and they put out the Aquostic Stripped Bare album. Now, this is the album that I actually got to interview Francis for, which was a thrill. Did a phone interview, and this I love this album. The version of Pictures of Matchstick Men with the strings and stuff, it's probably my favorite version of that song. But there you go there. And of course, with the label realizing just how popular that album was and how many copies it sold, they sent him back in the studio to record Acoustic 2, That's a Fact, which is more acoustic tracks, not as exciting as the first album, but still very much worth your while. Now, I purposely skipped something right before I started talking about the acoustic albums, because there's nothing studio-wise. And basically, in 2013, 2014, Francis Rossi, Rick Parfitt, Alan Lancaster, and John Coughlin, who were nicknamed the Frantic Four, they actually reunited and did a tour, or two actually, in 2013, 2014. Nothing available studio-wise, but there were a few live albums that came out of that. But once that was over, it was done, and they went right back into being the modern Status Quo. Now, sadly, after the release of Acoustic 2, Rick Parfitt actually had to retire from the band because he had had a heart attack early in 2016, and the band was going to continue, and they were going to bring in a new guitar player. But to my knowledge, Rick was still planning to work with them in the studio. But unfortunately, Rick passed away in December 2016, bringing a curtain down on that version of Status Quo. Now, 3 years later, the band did get back together with a young guitar player by the name of Richie Malone. I believe that he was actually the guitar player that replaced Rick before he died, when he had just retired. And they released the album Backbone in 2019. And it is an absolutely stellar, basic rock and roll album. Just great boogie, almost raw sounding, almost back to basics, no overproduction, just in your face, great boogie rock and roll, great melodies, great hooks, great songs. It's what Quo is all about, and it's great rock and roll. Now, I also have another version of that album, came in this little box here, and it comes with a CD with some bonus tracks and a live CD. So that's another version of this album that I have in my collection, which I'm very, very grateful for. That is it with the Status Quo studio albums. I do have a couple compilations in my collection, including Excess All Areas, which coincided with the release of their book, which I've read a few times. And that's a 2 CD set there. I also have Pictures, 40 Years of Hits, the deluxe edition, which features 2 CDs and a DVD. Now, in September of 2021, original bass player Alan Lancaster passed away, which was one of the things that spurred me on to do this video, which I'd been planning to do for months. And sort of as a tribute to him, I decided to go forward and make this video. Now, I know that he was involved in a few bands, none of which I own anything by. I'm not quite sure how much is recorded by Alan Lancaster. I do know that Francis has a few solo albums out. King of the Doghouse came out in 1996. One Step at a Time came out in 2010. He also has an album from 2019 called We Talk Too Much, which is sort of a duet album with a folk country vocalist called Hannah Ricard, which I have coming in the mail. That's actually what I was waiting for to make this video, but I thought I'd make the video now. And Rick Parfitt had recorded an album in 1985, which remains unreleased. And then he was working on some solo stuff shortly before he died. And that was actually released posthumously as Over and Out. Most of the tracks were recorded in, I guess, 2015. And one track features Brian May. There's another track that features John Edwards, their current bass player, with backing vocals by Alan Lancaster. I know one song, Halloween, on this, I believe was taken from the sessions from the 1985 album, because they feature both John Edwards and Jeff Rich. And that was the rhythm section he was working with at that time. Anyway, that is it. I hope that's enough information for you to go and start building your own Status Quo collection, or Status Quo, as I call them here in the U.S., either on LP, cassette, CD, whatever you want to do. Just start building that catalog and start where you want. You want the boogie rock and roll? Well, I told you about it. You want the poppier stuff? I told you about it. You want the psych stuff? I told you about it. Remember to like, comment, share, subscribe, and to leave a comment down below. And until the next time, remember me, I'm Steve Schnee, the CD Junkie.